Good afternoon. My name is Dan Brook. I'm a retired professor, sociology professor and clergy living here in Hudson, Wisconsin. We're delighted to be with you again today. We again are really eager to have a conversation, faith-based conversation on the three really majority faiths on the planet, I think. The Muslim faith, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and that's not to diminish the others, but we have enough to talk about with these three, and we're happy to be here with you again. And shortly, these fine gentlemen will introduce themselves to you. What we're going to talk about is something that definitely has a religious basis, a moral basis, an ethical basis, and in a bit I'll introduce what that specific topic is. And we can only admit that there are many, many things we could be talking about. Virtually everything that goes on in our nation and on this small planet has some religious dimension to it, some spiritual dimension, some ethical dimension. And I was interested just a couple of days ago as I was thinking about this to find a website. You might want to look it up. It's called rankingamerica.com to see where America ranks on some of the great moral issues of our time. And just for a little fun to get us going, I'd be happy to share with you that we're really good in the United States about a number of things. We rank first in oil consumption, for example. This one surprised me. We ranked second in consumption of beer on this planet. We rank second in the ecological footprint we place on this small planet. So we're good at those things. We're not so good in government spending. We actually rank 121st out of 176, even though we hear the hue and cry all the time about how much our government is spending too much. We're actually kind of chintzy spenders in our country. We rank 46th in civil liberties that we grant to our citizenry, which is the lowest of any fully democratic country on this planet. We rank 20th in freedom of press. We rank 17th in the amount of democracy we actually practice in our day-to-day lives. But the thing we're going to talk about today is really how we treat, deal with, define, develop relationships with strangers. And in that case, I did a little research on how we deal with immigrants in our country. And you may be surprised to know that we rank 38th in the amount or percent of immigrants we have in our country. Actually, only between 12 and 13% of our population is based on immigrants, and yet we seem to have a kind of a large concern about how many people we're leaving into this country. As I mentioned a little bit before we came on the air, 85% of our land space is open. It's non-populated, so we have plenty of space. The percent of our population that's immigrants is quite small, and yet it's a concept that seems to divide us right now. So with that rather lengthy introduction, I'm delighted to allow these fine gentlemen to introduce themselves to you. And Dean, maybe you would start.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. My name is Dean Simpson, pastor of Cross Lutheran Church, which is a little town about 10 miles from Hudson. I'm going on my 16th year there and been a Lutheran pastor now for about 27 or 28 years, I guess. So,
thanks, Dean. Rob?
I'm Rob Wertheimer. I live and work in Hudson. I'm a local attorney. I've been practicing now for just over 23 years, and almost 21 of them in actual Hudson. I grew up in New York City and come from German Jewish parents.
Do you want to say just a little bit about your mother? Because here in this area, there are probably not too many folks like you for a lot of reasons, but also because of your family background.
Well, I'm a first-generation American, and my mother, who was in Germany during World War II, was a hidden child. In other words, she's a Holocaust survivor. Her mother, my grandmother, perished in the Holocaust, and so that's something that I continue with my heritage. I talk in the high school at the Holocaust class in Hudson about that, and so it's part of my heritage.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm Özcan Kilic, and I'm originally from Turkey. I teach marketing for over 20 years, and I first really want to congratulate you for such a noble undertaking to have us here, and I hope that this discussion will lead to better understanding among different faith groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you for being here. The first thing we're going to discuss today is asking each of these folks to express from the perspective of their own faith exactly how, from that faith tradition, they define and how they develop relationships with strangers. And once again, Dean, maybe from the Christian perspective, you'd be willing to sort of share what the Christian perspective is on dealing with strangers.
Well, my understanding of that, Dan, is that we sort of take it from the Old Testament. There is that interesting verse in Hebrews, be careful how you treat strangers, because some of you have entertained angels unawares. And it's easy to be kind of spooky about that verse and think of supernatural beings, but an angel, of course, is any messenger from God. And to see the stranger as potential messengers to us from God is an important part of the Christian tradition, as well as, I think, the Jewish tradition from Abraham on, meeting the three strangers, announcing the birth of Isaac, and so on. I think hospitality has been a strong value throughout the Mideast, which all of our scriptural traditions arise from. And the idea that God will meet us in the stranger, in the person other than us, other meaning very different from us, is such an important teaching in the Christian tradition. Not one we live up to very well, I'm sorry to say, but one that ought to alert us to the fact that when we meet people who are different from us, in any way, in every way, different faith convictions, different ethnic backgrounds, different languages, different color, and so on, we really ought to get ready to hear a message that would be important and needful for us, a message from God, because we live in such a little confined world of our own. The stranger opens to us vistas that we were unaware of, and they make the world a larger place, a more interesting place, and so we ought to be able to entertain one another, show hospitality to one another. I think it's a very strong teaching in the Gospels and in the New Testament as a whole, one I'm afraid we don't pay as much attention to as we should.
As a Muslim, how do you respond to what he just said? Where can you find similarities and differences?
Actually, there's more similarities than differences, because I was lately reading the Quran, and in Quran says, God says, I create you in different tribes, communities, so that you can meet each other and get to know each other. So which means differences are natural. And but what we have to do is we have to be willing to get to know each other. So I think the main concern here is you want to know others who are different than you. There's many reasons for that, and main reason is, I believe, since you have to live together, you better know each other. That's the main reason, I believe it. And what he says, the hospitality came up right into my mind, is we have a saying in Turkish which means God's guest. So everyone who is even a stranger you don't know is welcome, because he is a guest of God, because he somehow leaded this person or to your house, to your property, and they're always welcome.
Fantastic. Rob?
Well, I brought a couple when, you had told us we were talking a little bit about strangers, so I have a couple quotes from the Old Testament that really talk about Jews, in not only knowing the stranger, but actually the quote of, "You were strangers in the land of Egypt yourself." So it's a very personal note that the Jews themselves are the strangers and have been in many ways. So just also, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt," and that's from Exodus. And then, "And if a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not wrong him, but the stranger who dwells with you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am your God." And that's from Leviticus. So it really talks about the Jews as being the strangers, the outsiders, the slaves, really, is what they were in Egypt until they were freed. And so it's very much, love the stranger, because basically love the stranger the way you would love yourself. They're the same. You were once that way, you must treat people the same way. And in a lot of ways, I think my mother, when she came over to New York, she didn't speak the language. She was thrown from her country. She had no homeland. She was a stranger. I mean, she went into a neighborhood where people all spoke her language and were Jewish, but in a lot of ways into this brand new place, she was a stranger among Americans. And you see that a lot. And really, there was a little, personally, when I came via Madison, but when I came from New York to Wisconsin, and especially in Hudson, felt a little strange here and there, and I'm sure you do too a little bit. So there's all that stranger aspect, and I'm reminded of that there, "But for the grace of God go I." Before you put someone down like that, you have to get along with them, because you could be in their shoes. So you need to think of yourself that way.
Rob, I hadn't even thought about that aspect of being the stranger. As soon as we welcome strangers, obviously the converse is true. We're a stranger to the other person as well. And I think of the golden rule at the heart of probably all our traditions. Treat others as you yourself would want to be treated. And certainly toward the stranger, that it's true then, if anywhere.
Well, I'm going to throw a little unexpected question your way, I suspect. In sociology, we talk about the real and the ideal culture. What you have been sharing is the ideal. I agree with it. I think you're really good guys. But your compatriots who confess to share each of your faiths don't live by it. So why is that, and what can we do about it, if you agree that that's a true statement?
I mean, not living by that might be a very harsh statement, I believe. I mean, for Jewish, Christian, and Muslims. But there's definitely people, Muslims, who may not obey and do this. That's correct. I just want to give an example. I recently had a friend here for academic research, and he left yesterday. And he told me that the people are here really friendly, because everyone greets you, everyone is smiling, and everyone at least express some appreciation that you're there, that they have seen you. And he says, quite different than in Turkey. Because in Turkey, people, if they don't know you, really don't greet you. So to come to your question, it happens. Maybe it's just because of the stress they're going through every day. And there's many reasons for maybe not practicing. But the religions, I believe, they mainly preach that we have to be welcoming to any stranger. And that's the case also in Islam. And when you meet a group of strangers, peoples, you say salam. And it's like in Jewish shalom, right?
Yes.
It's the same, means peace. So you have to say that. That's the way you greet even a stranger. And that's what the Quran says. When they meet strangers, they say salam. And it means peace be upon you. And it also means I refrain from doing any harm to you. So you can trust me. That's how it is. That's, as you said, ideological situation. And that's, some may obey, some not. But that's the general rule, general framework of relationship in Islam.
Now, about 30 years ago, a book was written called Holy Terror, The Rise of Fundamentalism in the World, Religious Fundamentalism. And so what we're talking about here is a minority of each of our faiths, I think, who nonetheless get the majority of the publicity. And so I think you've done a great job of telling us why it's important to welcome the stranger, to accept the stranger, because even selfishly, it enhances us.
That's correct.
As well as the person we're welcoming. But what has gotten into the mindset of the fundamental Christians, the fundamental Jews, and the fundamental Muslims, maybe I should say super fundamental, that have caused them to turn 180 degrees the message of each of your faiths into exactly the opposite direction?
One word that leaps into my mind, Dan, when you ask that question, is the word fear. And when people are afraid, when we're terrified, we react and act often in ways that we come to regret later. There's so much fear all around us and within us. I mean, we're born into a kind of a dangerous world. We learn that very early on. We learn ways of being that are designed to protect ourselves. And to the extent that we deny our fear, I think we more easily fall prey to it, pretending that our ways that are designed to protect us are simply, you know, our ways to get success and carry on and so on. We affect a kind of a bravado and so on and defend it, all the while denying that we're scared. And so much of life is designed to protect us from the other, of whom we're afraid. And we're all aware of stories of what those people are like, what they really are up to. And there's lies and suspicions sown like seeds among us. And we grow up with that, and before we even have time or even think to try to sift through and see what's really true and what's really false, we sort of buy into a lot of it. It's a world full of fear. That fear invades our churches, our mosques, and synagogues because we're there and we carry it around with us. And you know, another big word is sin, but we don't, any of us probably live up to what we say we believe in. But I think fear and its cousin or brother or sister, greed, are always at work, and we need to be suspicious of those forces operating first within ourselves as we approach the stranger. And we have to confess, we have not lived the faith that we profess. We have reacted to one another fearfully.
So you actually answered, I mean, fear definitely is one of the answers. And the reason of fear, I would say you answered it, is, I don't want to say, but the lack of really sincere faith. That's what it is. Because if you really sincerely believe in God, and your love to God will overcome your fear. That's how I see it.
I agree. I was going to.
No, I'm fine. Yeah.
That fear, a lot of places that I've is a lack of faith.
Yeah.
And so, and I like what you were talking about. The fear. It's the fear of the stranger. It's the fear of the unknown. Yeah. And unfortunately, though, with the extremism and the terrorism, it also turns into this never-ending pattern, where once you have the destruction upon destruction, and then my family was killed, so I got to get back at the person. That's an unending thing, which goes over beyond anything. From where it started, it may have started in some kind of thing, but at that point, you kind of I think of the Irish civil wars that went on forever, and just with Israel and Palestine, you have that ongoing thing that's been forever now, and it's very difficult. And on a one-to-one basis, there's people living side by side, they get along just fine, but politically, is a whole nother thing. But it is the fear of the unknown. And, you know, obviously if people look deep down in their religion, it doesn't give you the right to go around, you know, either whether you're whatever religious group you are, to kill the way people kill in the name of their religions. It's just, you know, and it is the unknown. And if everyone got together like we are, we've said this before in these groups, and sat down and just had some conversations, maybe, you know, then it wouldn't be the unknown. They would know who the person is that they're striking out now with all the, but any case, so.
As we get to know one another, the love that sort of happens naturally. I mean, it's just fun being with you guys, and I begin to experience a kind of an affection and a camaraderie, and that just casts out that fear. Love casts out fear, and so that's one important aspect of it. If we could just sit down and talk, can we at least talk? I think things, you know, opportunities like this are really important. When you were talking, Oskan, the other fear that I thought of, we're afraid of the stranger because of the things we've heard about them, but we're also afraid of our own folks. What will they think of me if I open myself to the enemy? And then what are my own people going to think? You know, I remember when Sadat was killed, you know, by his own people because he began to open himself to peace negotiations with Israel. And the political leaders in this country have to answer to their own sort of extremist at times constituencies who keep them in line with threats and backstabbing and so on. So it's not just fear of the stranger, it's fear of our friends and family members as well. Fear is a big one.
So just for the fun of it, if God made you the supreme cohorts of this planet, co-regents of this planet, what would each of you do first to try to break down the barriers of fear, mistrust, all the negatives that keep us from communicating with the other? That's not a big question, is
What?
it?
No, no. Was that
no.
one of the questions that you, I don't remember
No, he's
that.
surprising us.
We're going to talk about this.
Go ahead. I mean,
No. I've been talking quite a bit.
I think there's a blind. Everyone, myself, we have a blind. So if I could do it, I would lift whatever stays in between a person's heart, because we talk about seeing with your heart, because seeing with your eyes is depends on the stimulus, but with your heart it's more than that. So I would try to lift that blind and enable everyone to see the real truth.
But how exactly can you do that? And let me give you just a brief context. You know, when I was a parish pastor, I always felt it was kind of a waste of time pre-marriage counseling, because how can you sort of teach somebody to live together if they've got no experience in it? And so I see the USA, where such a small number of people actually have passports, and that same small number of people have actually even traveled any place, and a much smaller group that has ever lived someplace else. How else can you accomplish what you're talking about without exposing yourself to different people?
Well, one of the things we have in our faith traditions is the opportunity to preach and teach, and part of that is the telling of stories. The scriptures are full of stories, and there are lots of kinds of stories. So most of the stories, or many of the stories at least we've heard about the strangers, are terrifying stories, but we can begin to tell other kinds of stories, Dan. I may never get the opportunity to travel to the Middle East. But I can, listen and hear and interact with people who've been there, and listen to stories that reveal our common humanity, the struggles and the suffering and the pain of the people that I'm tempted to call my enemy. And I began to see them in a human context through stories. So we have to watch our language, watch the kind of stories we repeat about the people we're afraid of, and try to tell more merciful and humanizing stories. Perhaps we underestimate the value of that. We probably don't do enough of that. But hearing about the suffering of the children among the Taliban even, to put a human face on those people as they struggle for what they perceive at this point to be the freedom and future of their own people and country. In my faith tradition, Jesus says, love even your enemy. So think about the people who like to regard me as their enemy and begin to try to see them as human. And I think storytelling can be a big, important part of that.
So when Dean mentioned children, what about we have 10 children here? They're from different cultural and ethnic and religious backgrounds. They get along well. Do they have any differences? They don't.
That's right.
They play. And that's really amazing that they play because they're natural. Well, it is because they are still having this divine in that within themselves. So they're divinely guided to be together. But once you grow up in your cultural environment, it doesn't matter which one, you get shaped. And I think then problems start to emerge. Then you have your preoccupations about someone else. So what I would suggest, every adolescent, a teenager, should go to a different country. So we as adults should allow our kids to visit different countries, or have children their age visit our country and have them maybe hosted in our house. So that would be at least one drop on the hot stone, but still something we could do concretely. Bring young people together. That's my solution. I don't know.
I like that plan.
Yeah.
No, I agree. It's the national, the cultural, the tribal differences that, hopefully aren't ingrained too early on. In some cases, they are. In these conflicts that have been going on forever, that these kids pick up arms when they're 10, 11 years old now. So you got to get them really young and to expose them to the whole world. Maybe have some giant international world convention where everyone gets together and actually gets to know each other a little better. I mean, on a larger scale, what we're doing here on a mega scale. And that might help a little bit too, as long as we're playing leader.
Well, here's a story I just read before I came here, and I'm going to tell it because I would like you to tell me if you think people hearing this story will change their attitude toward the object of the story. Here's the story I read. The news just came out today. I don't know if it'll be on the national news or not. But there were two independent people who have been studying the genealogy of a man named Barack Obama, our president. And to everybody's surprise, they found out that he was a maybe great-grandchild, maybe it's more than that, of probably the first slave to be brought to the United States from Africa in 16-something. And his connectedness to that first slave, who incidentally ended up marrying a white person, and subsequent generations passed as white fairly quickly on, was his mother. His mother was the descendant of what is probably the first known slave brought over from Africa. Now, hearing that story, remember we have a president who, in the eyes of some, is the other. he's not really American. When they hear that his ancestry through his mother's side goes back far further than any of the rest of us, do you think that story will change any perceptions?
Doubt it.
Now you're getting us into politics.
Well, no, this is the human condition.
You know, Dan, I've already heard this story being debated
Have you?
on TV and how valid it might, not on TV, on the radio, and how valid it might be and so on. It may have the potential to change some perspectives. Probably not on the basis of those kind of hardliners on either side who stick with their ideology no matter what. But perhaps some it can go, wow. I heard one, who was it? One of our a movie star, black movie star, saying Barack Obama is not our first black president. He's our first multi-ethnic president. But this story feeds into that, and that's really something to be proud about. I mean, Barack Obama then could be one who represents us all. I mean, maybe that's where you're going with that story, Dan. And if we make use of that story, then it could begin to appeal to our better selves. I like that.
I don't think you're going to change any, like you said, any hardliners. I mean, people have such hard feelings one way or strong feelings one way or the other concerning their politics. But as you're saying, though, it does kind of show how he is so ethnically diverse, and so how America is so ethnically diverse, and how we're all, we're a country of immigrants. We're a country made up, I think of the Statue of Liberty when you come into New York, and how it's supposed to welcome everybody. And we're supposed to be that country that welcomes everyone from all lands. And I think, and the fact that his ancestor had a marriage of a white and a black person, and so did his mother, and it comes full circle, and it is really a story of diversity, and I think of America.
Look, I won't comment on that. No, thank you.
Well, I was going to ask another
Yeah.
impossible question, so it might be better if you'd make some comments.
So I'm waiting for the other one.
Okay. Well, like all of you, and I think many around us, and I recognize that we're probably preaching to the choir in this program. But I hope not. I hope some of the conversation we're having will cause people to sort of rethink where they are, because it's caused all of us, I think, to rethink where we are, because there's really no place for what Christians call self-righteousness. There isn't one among us who, in some aspect of our own lives, don't want to keep certain others away from us and not be very friendly to them. So there's learning for all of us in here. But I'm thinking now about what we can do, each of us as individuals, to kind of expand the circle of those who, instead of being afraid to meet people not like us, are actually become eager to meet people that aren't like us, maybe selfishly, maybe just intellectually to learn about them, but for whatever reason. How can people come to want to meet people who are different than us, do you think?
I think what you were talking about earlier, or maybe it was you, but traveling. I mean, I think if people actually expand their horizons, and if they've grown up in a small town all their lives, or even if you've grown up in New York all your lives, but you've never been outside of that environment, get yourself in a different environment, again, where you're the stranger, where you're someone different, and where you're forced to look at it from a different perspective. I think, like you were talking about, you use that passport, or even if you can't afford to do that, then drive to Canada or Mexico, but get a different perspective from where your safety zone is, and see how the other half lives. And it at least gives you a new perspective, if not opens you up entirely. So I think getting out and seeing the rest of the world is a big help, seeing how other people are.
What about that huge majority now who does not have the ability to do that, to just can't do it in all parts of the world. We all can, but most people can't.
You know, there are, the other is all over the place. They're not just in other countries. And we began, the original conception for this conversation was as we approach our season of elections in this country, and what do we do about the great divide that we're all struggling with so much? The other meets us in that other political party, the one with whom we do not identify. And we can visit them because they're our next door neighbors. They're our brother-in-law in the same family and sister-in-law. I mean, here we are, one people divided. We're making each other in one country into the other through our political divisions here. So can we invite each other to spend a little more time listening and to try to understand the values that inform the politics of those with whom we disagree? So at least we can see we have common goals and common values. We disagree about how to get there. That's what politics is about. But we can begin to, by listening and opening ourselves to the other, begin to see we don't have to be enemies in this. We can agree to disagree sometimes and continue to treat one another civilly, and so on. So we don't have to travel, to the other side of the world or even to Europe or something. We can begin at home practicing civility, practicing listening, practicing, as the native peoples say, walking a mile in the other person's moccasins or Nikes or whatever they happen to be these days. I think we need to say that. I think we need to just say it to one another. Raise our voices against the insanity and the hatred, and just say it again and again and again, and invite people into that space of listening and peace and welcoming the stranger. Because until we think about it, it never occurs to us, because we just sort of follow our natural tendency to take sides. It's not working very well, folks, and we need to invite one another into some peace.
When you mentioned this, Dean, here, I mean, I'm maybe not here for a long time of period to argue about what you have said, but I can assure you it's the same in Turkey, because people are polarized because of their ideologies. And maybe we should come to a point where we should say, hey, what are these ideologies? Why don't we put them aside? Because we talked about God's word, right? About how God is trying to get us together and unify us through different faith perspectives. So here's God's word, and here's the ideology, human-made. Which one is more worthy for us in the end? I go for God's word and not for the ideology. So that's the reason why it's been for a few years now, I reject all the ideologies. I think that's what really hurts us, ideology.
Of course, the problem is, in my judgment, I hope you can put me in my place here, is that religion and ideology get mixed. And it's because there is what God's word says. That's always understood from human interpretations.
That's correct, yeah.
And they vary, and those interpretations become ideological, and people are absolutely convinced that this is what God says.
Or is it because their ideology, that's kind of defines how they interpret God's word?
I absolutely believe that to be true, but the effect is the same. The result is the same.
That's right, you're right. Yeah.
And so what made me really uncomfortable in this conversation, and I'm blaming you for it.
Okay, I'll take it.
Is all of a sudden you're getting really personal here about, it's easy to talk about out there in other countries and not getting along, but you're right, we have more division right here. that we ought to be worrying about than out there. So for our listeners, I think we've probably got millions of you out there. I'm going to set an idea here, and you get back to the station and let us know whether you think this is a good idea. Maybe what we ought to do, because it would be so difficult, is find 3 other people with opposite ideologies from the faith perspectives, and let's see how just 6 of us together can work on breaking down some barriers. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Ooh,
I like it.
it's an interesting idea, all right, Dan. And we can always edit it all out. So, that would be, I'd be game for that.
Would you be game?
Yeah, I would.
Well, let's see if any of the listeners call in or write in and say, let's give it a shot. And in the meanwhile, we'll be thinking of people that we know of that would really, when we say, yes, God calls us to welcome the stranger, with the same conviction say, no, God says certain strangers we should stay clear of because they would pervert our tribe. Don't all of our faith experiences include that dimension also?
We don't usually say it that way, though, Dan. What they say is they want to kill us. They want to. It's not just they'll pervert our tribe. They want everything that belongs to us. They want to exterminate us, and so on. So the charge is you're being unrealistic. As soon as you start talking about peace, it's like that, making fun of that, saying, why can't we all just get along? Because they want to kill us. That's why. So we keep telling that story. Those who supposedly stand for realism versus our religious idealism and peacenikism and all that. So, I think both camps do have important things to say. And instead of talking at each other or talking about each other on a program like this, it might be really good to listen and get us together. So it's worth a try.
I think it would be a good perspective. I mean, especially from my point of view, you obviously, like you're talking about, have people in Israel who have, in their own minds, been fighting for survival since 1948 when they gained independence. And, they always talk about this as a survival thing. So if we have to do A, B, and C, if we don't, we'll be annihilated. And, at some point, it reaches a level where it's a little too much, though, and it is political. And so, I obviously want Israel to be there, but I think there needs to be a Palestinian state too. But I think, I think what you're saying is true. It definitely works that way.
I said my opinion.
You started.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's an easy question. If I can remember what I was going to ask you now. Oh, I would like each of you, from your faith perspective, to say one thing that you think people from other perspectives think is most wrong about what you believe. Is that clear? Think of one thing. Think of one thing that you think most people, most non-Christians, don't know about Christianity.
Well, I'm hearing 2 different questions,
Okay.
Dan. I don't know about what they don't know, but clearly the thing that most other people will think about Christianity that they would disagree with would be the teaching of the Trinity, and especially in the monotheistic traditions, this confusion of Jesus with divinity is the most unacceptable. And I don't know about the idea of incarnation. There may be openness to that, but with the exclusive focus on Jesus, the incarnate deity, and bound up in the Godhead itself, I think that's what the other religions find most unacceptable, but also most confusing about our faith. And yet, it is that in Christianity which calls us to be most open to others. Ironically, I don't think all Christians see it that way, but to see the God incarnate in human flesh is that sort of meeting God in the other idea. I think that's what the doctrine wants to teach us, about seeing God in the flesh of our fellow human beings. I mean, that's where that doctrine goes for me. I know that for many Christians it doesn't go that way, and they use that as a way of defining themselves over and against others, and you've got to accept that or you're unacceptable to God. I think that's a bad interpretation of that doctrine, and but it is the one that I think most others have the most difficulty with. And let's face it, a lot of Christians just scratch their heads over that as well. So.
Rob?
I'm trying to think about that one. So I guess what came to mind is how others might use that phrase of the Jews being the chosen people to somehow think that we're somehow superior, better, or different in some way, that this God-given thing, and I think that's kind of what came to my mind, and obviously I don't buy into that whole thing about kind of like that. So that's really what came to mind. I don't have a whole lot on it.
Thanks. Ashkan?
I'm sure there's so many
Misconceptions.
misinterpretations, or I don't know with which one to start really. So
Just one.
Just one. I would say Islam is not a religion of war.
What was that again?
Islam is not a religion of war, and I believe that that's what the right now, because of the terrorist attacks and is they think that Islam is a religion of war.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really creates major problems right now, and it's been supported by terrorists. It's been supported by the self-claimed Muslims, and I know that, and I think that's the issue. It's not.
No.
It's not.
Good. Well, listen, we've been having such a good time. Our time is up. We've committed ourselves to the possibility of another experience like this with other people across the table. We'll see what our listeners say. And until then, it's been great being with you guys again. Most thankful and grateful for the friendship that we have developed among ourselves, and hope that it shows and is demonstrated as we deal with other folks in the community and elsewhere. So thank you for being here. Thank you for watching us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.